This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry about that. So much for getting on early to test everything. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I think we'll get started. I'm happy to introduce Natalia Cisneros, or Tyre, as many of you will have known her if she's been interviewing you. She was a student last year at the Cambridge Conservation Leadership Masters Programme, which is held at the Cambridge Zoology Department in the UK. And one of the things that they do as part of that master's program is to do a project as part of the course. And she chose to do a project looking at the KBA National Coordination Groups that have been established to date, try and draw some lesson learned about how they're structured differently and what could be learned about some of the best ways to try and structure KBA National Coordination Groups, and how to set them up in a way that they are productive and can work quickly on identifying key biodiversity areas. So without much further, I'll let Tyre take over and she'll give her presentation. You can save questions and ask them physically at the end. That would be better because, as I said, we're recording this and we'd like to post it on the YouTube site. So I'd rather have that than you putting questions in the chat, please. Thank you. Welcome, Tyre.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. Are you able to see it? All right.
Yes, see that fine.
So, good morning, everyone. Or should I say, well, for me, it's the morning, afternoon for most of you. I see people from all time zones. Thank you for joining today. It's good to see some familiar faces of some people from the research. So today I will be sharing results from the research project that, like Andy said, I conducted between May and August last year as part of my master's studies dissertation. And well, I'll be talking about what works and what, in short terms, like what works and what doesn't work as well in KBA National Coordination Groups. So I'm assuming that if you are here, you are already familiar with key biodiversity areas, but what about the national coordination groups of the KBAs, the NCGs? So the aim of establishing a national coordination group is to coordinate KBA information, monitoring, and conservation at a national level so that these processes of identification, monitoring, and conservation can be driven from within a country and not from outside. So KBAs at a national level, which, as you can see in the map, are basically everywhere in the world, would ideally have an NCG to support them in this process. And at the time of the study, 11 NCGs had been created around the world, and there were others in the process of being formed and still are. So NCGs are then what has been lately being called multi-stakeholder forums, or MSFs, or platforms, which are basically deliberately organized spaces with a common objective that serve, that include a series of stakeholders from different sectors, like it could be from the government, international NGOs, or academia. So, however, the KBA NCGs are a relatively new concept, and as of the beginning of last year, there was very little information or no information on how they function, where they have been effective, and why. So these are some of the overarching questions that Andy from the KBA Secretariat and Thomas Starnes from IUCN were interested in providing answers to, which were then translated into the aims of the research that I then conducted as part of the study. So the aim of this research was to learn more about what processes and outcomes in KBA's work, where the key challenges and bottlenecks are, and recommending potential ways forward. And the research question guiding this was, what are the processes and outcomes, both internal and external, that influence an NCG's effectiveness in achieving its objectives? I began with a literature review, reviewing IUCN and KBA documents and publications from KBAs, as well as scholarly literature and multi-stakeholder forums and factors that affect its effectiveness, which would be the NCG's, of course, effectiveness. Second came the preparation of questionnaires. So with information learned from the review, I designed a set of questionnaire templates to conduct in-depth interviews that would allow us to understand how the NCGs work and, well, the objectives of the study. We created different questionnaires, typology questionnaires, theory of change questionnaires, participant perspective questionnaires. But due to time constraints, we faced the decision of either being too generalistic or too context specific, which means that we could either take all questionnaires and focus on a detailed single case study or a country, or take one type of questionnaire and apply it to as many countries as we could to understand the cross-cutting issues for NCGs around the globe and to provide results as a preliminary study. So then we decided to use the theory of change questionnaire since it provides more insight about the process of planning for the NCG's establishment. And it implies understanding how and why these processes were designed and if its current operations differ to how they were initially planned, and looking at the principal challenges and opportunities. Then we conducted pilot interviews and later began with the interviews. So for the interviews, because the knowledge about setting up and running the NCG processes is rather specific, interviews were conducted with people who had either been involved in the process of establishing an NCG or chairing or organizing. Sorry, could I please ask all of you to mute your microphones? Thank you, it makes it easier. All right, so in total, 18 people with experience in setting up NCGs in 16 countries were interviewed. And it is important to highlight that due to this, the study's results are partial and somewhat oriented or biased towards those establishing, organizing, or leading an NCG's point of view. Since the views of those participating as participants, not as organizers or conveners, could be different and they could be able to observe things that the organizers may not. So I just wanted to leave that out there. So questions in the interviews included how NCGs addressed or aim to address external factors like development priorities, political will, as well as internal ones like how decisions are made, how stakeholders are selected to participate, what principal issues have hampered or boosted effectiveness or equity using prompts. Then of course came the analysis and the write-up and the preparation of the final deliverables. So because this was a first attempt at studying NCGs and due to the limited time frame, we could not be overly ambitious with the outputs. We had a lot of ideas, but they were not really too feasible. So from an initial list being realistic with the time that we had, we finally narrowed these down into 2 products that were already handed in. A document with a general overview of NCGs containing details on the most frequent or important challenges and strengths usually faced by NCGs, either in setting up the process or in running it. And a short guidance document to support the establishment of new NCGs. So these are the outputs of the research. Like I said, I already handed them in and they contain the results, the consolidated results, which I will jump to now. So I will deep dive a bit. There was a lot of information and I tried to consolidate the most important or relevant pieces in this part. So please bear with me and I hope it's not maybe too dense or complex. So these are the results that inform the 2 outputs that I presented as part of the research mentioned in the previous slide. So first of all, the results, like I said, are not meant to be in-depth results because the NCGs are very new and there is so little information on them. This was meant to be more of a first attempt to catch a bigger glimpse. So yes, the interviews were in-depth, but this is more of a what is working in general and what isn't. So it is meant to serve as an introduction to NCG research. All right, having said that, what works well? Things that have worked for NCGs include different points. One of the first things that countries that reported, so the countries that reported an exhaustive socialization process considered it as key to making their NCGs work. What is socialization though? Like, it is basically how to adjust the NCG process to a society and how to foster engagement. So this can be done through relationship building and deepening understanding on what the process was about or is about with different stakeholders. So in countries where this had been conducted beyond like a superficial level, you could say, like when that had taken really the time and done it exhaustively, this allowed for a clear understanding of what the KBA and NCG concept, which are both complex concepts, were about, and were common objectives between the NCGs and other potential participating institutions or institutions that would help with a goal, like government offices, ministries, or NGOs are. So like by identifying the common objectives, building towards them. So to build a stable and solid base of enabling factors, they need to be properly engaged, which, like I said, takes time. And a well-conducted socialization process also tends to leverage support for the continuity of NCGs, like, for example, embedding them in a structure that can include it in the NCG and KBAs and its mandates, or provide expertise, provide funding, obtaining decision-making support, or simply opportunities to inform decision-making in a country. Another thing that made a difference was finding the right moment to piggyback ride on existing initiatives, such as an international, national, or subnational events, or congresses and launches. This creates more visibility. For example, in Canada, they did the launch of the CBD strategy Target 1, which built momentum on ONCMs or with IPLCs. So it is always useful to map out what is happening out there and trying to merge both processes as a solution to some of the things that are being pitched or launched. Also, in some countries, the participation of experts, for example, renowned academics or taxonomic experts, gives the process a perceived technical legitimacy. However, countries that are participatory beyond technical expertise obtain a greater perceived legitimacy, which is then translated into more acceptance of the process. For example, including subnational or local groups who can revise information or question its procedures gives a perceived legitimacy. That expert-only legitimacy alone does not always provide. In some countries, it was also pointed out that this also eased coordination purposes for stakeholders working on biodiversity, like mobilizing data, generating information coordinately, sharing information to inform or ease decision-making, and others. My fourth finding on what works well was that a handful of people recognized NCGs as having the opportunity to level the playing field for what they identified as less powerful taxonomic groups, such as invertebrates, versus other groups that tend to have more information regarding their species. I will talk later more about differences in power of taxonomic groups and the challenges. So people argue that this would also support the KBA process in delivering more accurate results that are reflective of a more holistic reality. These are opportunities, though. The next finding was that respondents who mentioned that they had... Hello, could I please ask you, thank you, to unmute yourself. All right, so respondents who mentioned that they had created adaptive management structures, considered that this had supported them in reacting to unforeseen circumstances like COVID-19. Another point was that NCGs that had designed their structures or processes according to each specific context, such as identifying socio-political processes that could either hinder or strengthen the NCG's work, found that to be an advantage. So designing around the context and then creating from there, instead of designing and then taking it to a context works. This also helps to better plan, anticipate contingencies, and adapt the structure to something that actually works in a specific context. Another point that works well were that NCGs were considered by, well, one person considered these to be crucial opportunities in which sensitive or uncomfortable or even underlying historical topics could be openly and constructively addressed, like finding solutions to a way forward so that unspoken tension may be mitigated. This also helped people to trust the process. And in these cases, a facilitator who was aware of sensitive issues and capacitated to be impartial is key. Some argue that for delicate discussions, an external facilitator was considered to be suitable to resolve sensitive topics. Another strength was, of course, the identification of KBA, so a very straightforward one. There is a lot of strength in the technical process. That was also finding. Another point is that NCGs found it helpful to have clear roles and responsibilities for each member or each type of member. So clear terms of reference and or guidelines. NCGs who underwent writing terms of reference for their own NCGs mentioned that the process had become easier and clearer for everybody to understand and follow. And even writing the terms of reference was a process that allowed people to understand how NCGs work better. One person mentioned that this, although it was very vital, it was crucial for the function, it was very time consuming. So it took them approximately like 1 year to write and appoint members, roles and responsibilities, the terms of reference, and demarcating the direction of the group. And the last, what works well finding is that although the vast majority of NCGs noted a funding as a source of difficulty, we'll also get back to this later. A few respondents considered that one of the main benefits to connecting KBAs as a global platform was that it offered exactly this, right? Like a platform to more access to funding through international partners or through international congresses or events, if the opportunity is, again, used correctly. So capacities are still lacking in this. We'll get to that also later, but these are in general the things that have worked well. And now we move on to the challenges and bottlenecks. So overall, more challenges than successes were brought up, and with more frequency than successes. I think this is normal because, well, the NCGs are still being figured out. They are still a new concept. More than 20 challenges were identified. So for the sake of time and like your patience, I will only be discussing a few here. So I will start with the challenges that may be more visible or more easily identified. The first one is, well, these are all things I'm sure that people with NCGs are already quite familiar with, so it might not be already new. The first one is biodiversity information gaps. So with which it may be hard to make decisions for the benefit of a species if, for example, their distribution is not well known. Also, information may be outdated. The second one is that some countries faced weak or inexistent systematic conservation planning structures or governance frameworks. So this hindered the process of a national recognition or like in general of the KBA process. Some people were asking, like, for example, I already have my natural protected area. So there also seemed to be a misinterpretation of what this really is meant to be and not really understood as an umbrella term. Another challenge that I'm sure many of you may be familiar with is that the KB, well, people in the participants, sorry, could I please remind participants to mute their microphones? Thank you. So participants considered that the KBA standard is not really perceived to favor all taxonomic groups equally. Some people consider that it favors mammals, birds, and charismatic species mostly, and that it is not equally applicable to all taxonomic groups like mollusks or understudied species, or turtles, freshwater species, or insects. Some interviewees also argued that there are challenges in including how to integrate criteria C sites, that is the ecosystem integrity criteria, And they mentioned that the global criteria, there are a few gaps in terms of allowing flexibility for national or regional processes, so that consolidation efforts could be expanded to include protection, even if they don't meet the global criteria, like how to make exceptions. Another point that we already touched upon, and this is always an issue in conservation, is that there is an overall large funding gap to conduct NCG activities. Two interviewees argued that funding was scarce because of maybe a lack of willpower and interest in KBAs. Others argued that decision makers were not yet seeing the value of KBAs in their countries. This is why that socialization process is really crucial. One interviewer mentioned that one of the risks was that because KBA processes are expensive ones, some countries may prefer to perform a top-down desk review to save money and resources than to conduct an adequately conducted assessment. And another easily identifiable challenge is capacity gaps. So these not only include being able to identify, map, and monitor KBAs, it also includes capacities on how to fundraise or how to build relationships with key stakeholders. Also, the capacity in which people in volunteer roles are able to support the process, as they are already very stretched on time and workload, which has influence in their motivation or availability as well. So in addition to those, there are also more like invisible challenges or bottlenecks, or like less evident ones. I compared interview results also to the literature review of factors that the literature points out to influence a multi-stakeholder firm's success. And so here are a few results. So the first one is that the KBA concept is not an easy one to grasp for those outside conservation, and even sometimes for those inside conservation. So this is why socialization is really important. Many interviewers considered that the KBA process had not taken off in many of these countries because they were not seeing how their country's needs were being maybe taken into account, like what the need to have a KBA is. And they did not see how this would tangibly create any benefits. So there is also confusion sometimes regarding other existing or prior conservation criteria, because KBAs is an umbrella concept that encompass different conservation criteria. There was confusion. So if the country had, for example, worked with important bird areas before, or IMMAs, there was that sometimes maybe even more challenging to understand than starting from scratch, because they needed to re-understand the concept. An interviewer also highlighted that he had assumed that some KBA partners strongly understood what KBAs were about, and these people could act as spokespeople to explain these, but it turned out that these partners were often familiar with outdated or previous KBA criteria or other kinds of criteria, like I said, like IMMAs or IBAs, which they assumed to be similar to KBA. So the assumption that even those in conservation understood was not always so. Another challenge when evaluating if NCGs have been effective in reaching their objectives is that there appear to be different interpretations of what these NCGs are and what their very objectives are and what they're supposed to be. So if we compare effectiveness with the objectives, then what are we comparing them against? We didn't always have the same like baseline, because there were different interpretations. Another challenge was that people perceived to be a gap between technical conservation or biological sciences and the social aspects of conservation. So interviewees pointed out that the NCG process was perhaps too technical, and it is a technical process, you know, to map and to identify these. It's based on sometimes map data, like satellite data, but that it may be missing important non-technical aspects. So it was pointed out that this fails sometimes to bring in people with non-technical information that could complement the technical conversations, like maybe somebody with traditional knowledge on nesting sites. Others pointed out that there was already too much information in the scientific process, and more information of this kind was maybe not what was needed the most. And they would have liked to see how NCGs or other KBA processes could be strengthened by other social aspects like communication or governance. Somebody also said that there was a lot of strength in the technical processes, but it takes a lot more to make them work on the ground. That the coordination and cooperation processes at a national level are still very weak. So I'm only on the third one, moving on to the next one. Another issue that hinders the effective conservation of the process is when NCGs do not address, and sometimes it's not even evident, so it's not easily identified when there are power imbalances in their processes. Interviews recognize that certain taxonomic groups, like I was mentioning earlier, could be powerful if they have maybe more information or better organized information than other taxonomic groups. Many mentioned that, for example, the bird sector usually has more leverage over these processes because the taxonomic group has more information or better curated information on the species that they represent. A few people even considered that and because of maybe this misconception of what IBAs and KBAs were, like that in some countries, KBAs had been recategorized as KBAs without taking too much into account other taxonomic group data. Please don't get upset at me for these results. These are only perceptions. So it's good to take them into account so as to avoid these biases. I think at least putting them out there, it's important so as to avoid them. So in this way, stakeholders or stakeholder groups with more power maybe inadvertently perhaps be pushing for their own agendas in detriment of others' priorities. And it is important to know that these answers also came from people who had been involved in setting up or running the process. So mere participants could have additional thoughts on this, or even like non-participants. This also may be applicable when power comes from a position, like for example, if a powerful stakeholder is a chair or even a stakeholder group chairs the NCG, if the group of like-minded people it's only a group of like-minded people, they could be inviting their networks and other like-minded people only to participate in the process. So it doesn't really, like if this happens, this could result in multi-stakeholder elites, which I will be getting back to later. So that's another point to take into account. And there may also be inequity in capacities or even in confidence in voicing opinions. Somebody even expressed this as a matter of interpreting silences based on the country and the context. Like each context is very different. Some cultures are not confrontational, so they will not voice a no. But for this, there also needs to be cultural awareness. So like I said before, knowing the context and actively designing the NCG structure around it is very important. Another issue was that participants considered the NCG process to not be clear enough. So most NCGs lacked a strong planning process when it was being established, where clear, tangible objectives were set and where a strong theory of change process was conducted to see, for example, who to invite, to which stages each person or group should be invited to which kind of organization they should seek to host the NCGN, when to conduct what kind of actions or activities, or how often meetings should be held, etc. Interviews also considered that generally clarity on guidance on how to set up and run the NCG was very urgently needed, just as much as there is a guidance document on how to work with KBAs, since they considered the existing terms of reference that currently exist as broad. So clarity was also needed regarding what each institution or person's responsibilities were within the NCG. This was needed, like I said, like even when considering who to invite, like as audiences need to be targeted. Like for example, if certain group is invited to participate to the wrong stage, like if a decision maker or a high level person is invited to review a technical process or to a training workshop, they may lose interest and this may backfire and the chance to build bridges may become lost. However, people who can be present in external meetings, or they can still be present in external meetings or presentations without being in, the activities need to be targeted with audiences. Interviewers also stressed they're dependent on KBA partners or international liaisons for guidance on this process. And most of these people are already very, very stretched. So again, guidance and independent guidance would perhaps make this easier. Another challenge is that multiple respondents perceive the KBA process to stagnate beyond the identification stage of KBAs, so that it risks actual and effective also KBA conservation. Like, I'm not saying that NCGs need to manage KBAs, but preparing the field for their effective conservation would help. Answers in this category include that in some cases, like since KBAs are not legally binding, its fate lies in the goodwill of people or authorities to do something about like KBA's effective conservation. Respondents also mentioned that in some of these areas that make sense in paper are really unmanageable for different reasons. And I know like that one thing is the map, because it maps out what where these places are and where the nesting sites are, like it's based on data, but in reality it may be unmanageable, which could be a challenge. One of these reasons may be because environmental authorities in some of these countries are not always from the most powerful sectors, like they may be overturned by more powerful stakeholders like the Ministry of Energy and Mines, for example, who may have different priorities. And another reason for these sites also being sometimes difficult to manage is that different socio-political contexts may hamper these important sites in practice if they are not taken into account, like the struggle of IPLCs for land tenure rights, which I'll also get back to in a later point. On this point also, other 5 respondents argue that some of the identified KBAs work in theory, but because sometimes it is easier to delimit an unmanageable site than one that really works, so as to avoid the extra work, an unfeasible area may end up being selected. So many highlighted that there are no clear guidelines on what to do next beyond the identification of these sites, or even how to monitor them. And then the next point on the less evident challenges is related to participation gaps. So the previous point is then tied to this one too. Participation gaps were noticed in different aspects. One of them is that there, like I mentioned also earlier, that there may be insufficient inclusion of individuals who are not like-minded, like the ones leading the process. Like sometimes it can be a single taxonomic group, like maybe a plant group leading the process or a mammal group leading the process. It may not be too representative of biodiversity in the country, and important information may be missed. So like I was saying before, some academics even call multi-stakeholder forums that are only composed of like-minded individuals as multi-stakeholder elites. So to avoid this, it needs to be more representative. Like maybe the chair needs to be selected amongst a group of stakeholders who are truly representative of biodiversity in the country, and not only from a limited group. So representation of like taxonomic groups is one thing, representation of sectors is another thing, and representation of different levels is yet another thing. So there was a perception of an absence of land managers or IPLCs who could know how things work on the ground. So therefore processes often lack bottom-up knowledge to complement top-down knowledge and articulate across sectors. Like I said, this may result in a lack of information regarding consulting rights to land and consulting how the process affects people at the local level, and even how they can be involved in the process for when it needs to be managed later on. So even if things work out in paper, they may be completely different in reality. Like an interview mentioned that sometimes a trigger species aimed to being conserved is not even in the site that the maps point towards. And in some occasions, that people at local levels may not be even aware that they live in a KBA, and the effective conservation of a KBA would depend on them, maybe as an OECM. But for it to work, relationships need to be built in time and in preparation for those who will be implementing the conservation efforts, like the management efforts, whoever they are. So if a KBA, for example, overlaps with their territories, they need to be brought in at the right time to be familiar with the process and to not perceive KBA as means to perhaps like a land grab or something that is a threat, or that another concession right will be granted in the same place, but as the opposite, as a chance to be empowered and OECM custodians so that they can be involved in the management of these sites. And this is really crucial on making KBA's work on the ground. So therefore, the importance of bringing them to avoid imposing a process on them, and to avoid also mistrust. And if the process is perceived as imposed, especially in areas of a lot of historical conflict, like I said, like with land rights, which in some countries has even resulted in deaths, despite sometimes like good intentions of initiatives. So there are also barriers besides, like for IPLCs, like the participation, even if they're not like actively participating in the technical process, there's different ways to involve them. And there are also barriers to IPLC or effective local participation. They don't necessarily dominate the technical language, or are maybe not confident enough to voice like the priorities and concerns. On the other hand, if consultation is consulted with these populations, this can strengthen the perception of legitimacy of KBAs at a local level. And another group that was also limited in its participation was the private sector. Again, this does not necessarily mean to include them directly at NCG meetings, but finding how they can support the process, like maybe financing a project or a behavioral change. This stakeholder group was perceived by some as important to create awareness and opportunities for alliances, but however, some fear that alliances with the private sector could maybe tarnish the NCG's reputation. And even some interviewers perceived that the participation and engagement of already participating NCG members could sometimes be ineffective if they were convened and attended meetings, but still felt maybe a lack of a voice or a lack of confidence, again, or to say that they don't understand or agree with the process. So it is important not to mainstream participation in these processes so that it becomes a tick box exercise. And English was also, somebody else said, I thought this was really interesting. If you don't speak English, you don't stand a chance. So these are things to take into consideration. Even some of the countries that translated their TORs into the language spoken in the country, it proved to be something that helped them quite a lot. So this point is also, the participation point is also linked to the next one, which is that the KBA process was perceived to have too much of an international focus sometimes and not enough of national ownership.
Yeah, my people, I'm in meeting here.
Sorry, can I please ask you to mute your microphone? Thank you. Interviewers argued that KBAs are largely considered an international process that national level stakeholders often did not feel identified with. Some explained that the process was perceived as a top-down process designed in the global north and thus failing to connect people and who feel a lack of ownership in the process. And ownership is crucial for engagement, and engagement is crucial for continuity. So if countries do not perceive the KBA process as theirs or as carrying their voice, when international NGOs project ends, or when like maybe the financing aid, like or NGOs stop working in the country, the KBA work may just risk being discontinued. I added some quotes here on that last point. So these points show that the problem may be that people may not be understanding KBAs as they are meant to be, like that little quote on the top. It's not an IUCN listing, but it's an umbrella term that encompasses more. So it may not be being understood as it's supposed to be, but also, and it may be perceived to have been designed by global, it shows that people perceive it to have been designed by global north actors. So there is lack of maybe socialization regarding this point as well. Sorry, can I please remind you to mute your microphones again? Thank you. So this is why it's so important to have a perceived legitimacy from other groups. This is done by participation through different degrees and different stages, but participation nevertheless. Okay, this was a lot. I hope you're still with me before I move on. The next parts are shorter and I think easier, but there were just like so many findings that it's really difficult to select which ones to talk about. There's others that I didn't mention, but I think these are maybe the most important. All right, so in terms of addressing the challenges and bottlenecks, the first thing is that, to begin with, a revision of clear, detailed objectives by the global KBA group would be helpful, like setting a clear vision and mission of the NCG so that there is a more stable base or like coherent base to build NCGs on that is aligned. Another thing is that when establishing a new NCG, careful and robust theory of change process or a planning process, it's really, really crucial, and not necessarily doing things ad hoc. Sometimes it works, and people find it easier to adapt, but it's always better to anticipate some of these issues. So here different aspects could be covered, and like I said, anticipating any potential doubts that could occur or having different interpretations of what the objectives could be. Also establishing membership roles, etc. This also helps to anticipate bottlenecks and to better plan. And if this is done, if the NCG is set up according to the context of the country, or maybe like if the country is too big, like in a subnational groups are required, and it's important to design it based on the context and not the other way around. So a good planning process could in turn feed into the next point, like the development of clear terms of reference for NCGs with clear roles and responsibilities. So like by doing this theory of change process, then the different aspects are identified, and those can be just like taken into the terms of reference while the theory of change process is being developed. So clear roles and responsibilities with ideally a conflict transformation strategy. I know this sounds maybe like scary or intimidating, but it's in reality just a tool for how to deal with maybe different opinions or to balance out power inequity. Another important thing is a robust and meaningful socialization process. That's the purple one out there. So exhaustive relationship building and deepening understanding, finding common interests and objectives, and most of all, like taking the necessary time to do this well. And also monitoring and evaluation. So it doesn't need to happen like too often, but like periodically, maybe like once a year or once every 6 months, who is not present, who should be present, how are we engaging with external stakeholders, how are we improving our perceived legitimacy, are we being as participatory as we can, what skills and capacities are we lacking, what needs to be done to obtain them, are we all participating effectively, and if not, why? These are just some, like monitoring and evaluation encompasses so much more, but these are just like a few questions that like to outline the process. So to support these challenges found in the results, there are effective tools that support the establishment and monitoring of an NCG, which I will be presenting next. The first one is, this is a tool to establish new NCGs. Like what you see here is an adapted version of 4 documents, a tool created by Ratner and Smith, theory of change process, and also a monitoring tool designed by C4, and this study's findings. The way it works is that there are a set of questions in different categories that each NCG can follow that cover a series of aspects. So like by answering the question, then the aspects are already covered based on each NCG's particular context. So there are 3 main phases. You see purpose, people, and process that have 3 different subcategories in turn. And each subcategory has a series of questions to follow that, based on those discussions, would provide clarity on which pathways to take based on each context. Like I drafted some examples for this adapted tool here. Like for example, in goals, like our views on the goals and consequent possible solutions aligned enough to define a shared convening purpose? Do all stakeholders have the same idea of the objective? Our stakeholder views align on the means to solve the problem. The scope also, there's questions on the scale. There's questions on capacity for change means what the roles and attitudes of different actors in enacting or enabling the change could be. Which actors have the capacity to enact change? Do these stakeholders need to be a part of the NCG? In what capacity? What roles and responsibilities are required as part of the group members, and so on. For equity and power, it's basically how the interest of potential people can be best represented. How can capacity imbalances be managed? What power imbalances exists, and maybe is there anybody who has a unique ability to block or advance the process? What difference in capacities exist, and how do we overcome them? How do we support them? In networks of influence and trust, there's questions that guide basically what networks exist, what organizations can be bridged with to engage to provide trust, what are the best entry points to government or industries. Is there an already existing platform, like in this case, maybe like the Species Survival Committee, that how can we best interact with them? For the process, there's initiation and convening, like is a new platform or convener needed, or who has a legitimacy and capacity to convene? Questions regarding, well, those kinds of questions, like who should chair, should it be a co-chair, should it be fixed or rotational? And for approach, there's questions that look into what kinds of facilitation skills and processes are needed, over how long, what governance mechanisms need to be in place to ensure that the NCG achieves its purpose. Should it be embedded in an organization structure or not, you know? And the last one is monitoring and evaluation, like what resources are needed to support the NCG and build the capacity for it to continue after the initial investment. So this is the monitoring and evaluation actually links. This is for when NCGs are already established, right? So this first process, this first tool is to how to establish an NCG. And the next one that I'm presenting is for already existing NCGs to monitor their processes. So there's existing tools. This one's one created by C4. It's called How Are We Doing? A tool to reflect on the process, progress, and priorities of your multi-stakeholder forum, which in this case would be the NCG. And it helps to systematically monitor the NCG. It supports decision-making and collective planning for future actions. This is maybe like a more complex tool that if I go into it right now, like there's so many details that I would ramble on for maybe hours, and you don't want to hear me right now on that, and we don't have the time. But if you're interested in this, I can send you more information. We may be actually implementing this tool, well, maybe partially, maybe completely, also now in West Africa, actually. But what it does is it supports decision-making and collective planning for future actions. Like it provides a health check for the NCG based on different aspects. It reviews the practices and allows the group to learn from what the NCG has been doing well and not so well. So its aim is for the NCG to use this information to adapt its work, to identify and address problems, and to design a pathway for how to plan to achieve the NCG's objectives and follow its priorities. So that was my research in a nutshell and some of the key findings. I hope you found them useful. If you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Taya. That was very thorough. I would be interested in questions, and also if there are members of national coordination groups on this call who have perhaps addressed some of these challenges, being willing to talk a little bit briefly about what you've managed to do. I think if we keep the questions going on till 1:15, and I'll wrap up with I'll give you a little bit of news about possible sources of funding for NCGs at the end. So are there any questions? Use the hands in the chat, which is, if you look down at the bottom, you'll have a button called reactions with a smiley face on it. If you click on that, there's a raise hand bar at the bottom. Any questions? while you're all thinking of them, one thing I'll point out is that in response to Taya's suggestion of sort of clarifying how to set up NCGs, we are working on developing a document which she drafted and has since been edited and has been out to several of the NCGs for comment, and it's now with the KBA committee for comment. So we'll hope to have that ready for circulation in the near future. Someone is asking in the chat, German Ferrero, would it be possible to access this report? Which is the report you're referring to? Are the results of this work? So the thesis that Taya had to write up is not a sort of summary like this. So what we decided to develop from it was this guidance on setting up an NCG. Maybe Taya, you can explain a bit more on that.
Yeah, so, well, the results of this work are like very exhaustive. There's pieces of information that I've not even included here because it was like quite a lot. I drafted a report. It is somewhat like maybe more internal, based on like maybe what each country is going through. Maybe it can be adapted to share some of that, but it is basically also of the information from this webinar, which I would be happy to share. I mean, my PowerPoint, if that's of any use. But I think since it's also recorded, well, it's maybe not what you were looking for, but yeah, I can share my presentation.
Any comments on the challenges from any of the NCG members out there of how you try to address some of these challenges in equitability within the group or ability for everyone to play a role? So there's a question in the chat, Richard Sambola, can KBAs be national? So the global standard for the identification of KBAs, which was published in 2016, is for the identification of global KBAs. Canada has since come up with its own national KBA identification process, and they've identified national criteria. There's nothing against countries developing their own national criteria, but if you want your site incorporated in the world database of key biodiversity areas, then it has to be either a global or regional criterion. At some point in the future, we'll probably develop regional criteria, but we're trying to first test out all the global criteria, see how they work before moving on to regional criteria. So I don't know if that answers that question. One thing, then I'll talk a little bit about the funding for KBA National Coordination Groups. One of the things we've noticed is that it's quite difficult to get a little bit of funding to set up the group. Once a group has formed and started a bit of work, it's often easier to raise additional funding to keep the group going. And so one of the KBA partners, Rainforest Trust, they have what's called a rapid feasibility assessment grant. You can apply for it at any time you want for up to $20,000. And the idea that can be, it doesn't have to be for establishing KBA National Coordination Groups, but you can use it for that. And you can at least use it to bring people together, explain what KBAs are, do the networking that's needed that Taya's been explaining here, that we need to make people aware of what KBAs are and how to adapt them to a process that can be done nationally. So one of the things we at the KBA Secretariat try not to do is sort of tell you how to do this exactly, because each country is going to be different in how it does it. So we're trying to provide guidance to help sort of structure what you're doing, but without sort of saying you've got to do it this way. And KBA National Coordination Groups are nationally formed. And the idea is that the KBA National Coordination Group doesn't just identify KBAs in country, but that it'll work to make sure that those sites are conserved and recognized in national policy and legislation. And more around the world, the CBD process is beginning to recognize that KBAs will be one of the key tools used to guide the expansion of protection under 30 by 30. Donors are beginning to channel their funding towards KBAs. The private sector is also using KBAs as sites that they should try and avoid if at all possible. And if they're going to work near a KBA or within a KBA, they have to show that they will not be threatening the trigger elements that trigger KBA status at that site. So having KBA status at a site will strengthen the protection of a site. So it's very useful. I'll put in the chat the link to the Rainforest Trust, where you can look up the Rapid Feasibility Assessment Project. They're also offering large grants for the conservation of KBAs. So if you've identified a KBA that's unprotected and want to try and create a protected area, they have quite a bit of funding at the moment that they're looking to give away. So please consider it. I'd also like to thank Tom, who's got his hand up, who was involved in supervising Tyre as part of this project. And you have a question, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks, Tyre, for a great presentation. Really interesting to get that summary of your results. I know you did a lot of work to interview quite a lot of stakeholders from the different NCGs, and I think one of the things that, or the thing that I'm most excited about seeing next is us working together on this document of recommendations. So how can we take some of these challenges which you've identified and articulated so well here and turn those into recommendations that NCGs can use to, to help them be as effective and inclusive as possible. My question though was, I was just trying to remember whether you, as part of your interview process, identified any regional focal points, any RFPs, and whether whether you looked into at all how having a really good proactive and knowledgeable regional focal point affects or enables the NCG to establish and function well. So thanks again for a great presentation, really interesting and helpful.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, actually, it made a lot of a difference. Like I was saying in the results, sometimes also no response or a very delayed response from the chairs or from a regional focal point already gave information about like maybe how stretched in time they were or where their motivation was. So it definitely does influence. But this is also, as I understand, in most cases a voluntary role. So that is again like the funding gap, right? But it does have definite repercussions on like the effectiveness of the establishment.
Thanks, Ty.
I think one of the other things I would add is that by bringing the conservation community together to form these national coordination groups, you're actually a lot stronger in approaching donors like the EU, GEF within country, particularly if you've got government on board, because they see one of the problems with the conservation community is you're often chasing different goals, and this can actually bring everyone together pursuing one common goal. Getting a few questions in the chat. Don't be shy, please ask them. David Diaz is suggesting that perhaps we think about doing a module of the KBA training that focuses on setting up KBA National Coordination Groups. I think that would be a good idea.
I agree.
Victoria, do you want to talk about the Mozambique situation and your terms of reference?
Hi, Andy, everyone, can you
Hi.
hear me? Yes, perfect. I will just share something that we have done to establish our national coordination group. As I said on chat, we have to create we have to create a general term of reference for all the group, but we have make some structure within the group that we have one president, we have a chair, vice chair, we have a secretariat, we have one focal point for the Kbas. And in the case of Mozambique, we done something different because it's not a national coordination group only for Kbas, but we have also includes the red list. We deal with Kbas and also with red list aspects. And so we have to create a specific function, one focal point for KBA, one focal point for red list, and also a focal point for data management. And we have to create specific term of reference for each of these focal points so they can know better what they have to do and how to do it. Just make things more easy. This is very important to establish the role, a specific role of the group, so make it more functional, is what I was sharing here on the chat. Let's make clear.
Thanks.
Andy, if I may add also to David's comment or question, like, yes, I very much agree, like it is very much needed. More on NCGs. That is what most participants were also responding to in the interviews. In fact, we are starting, well, with a few people who are actually present here soon in West Africa, developing like also some trainings with some countries that are interested in establishing NCGs, and we're doing like adapted versions based on their needs, right? It all depends on what stage they're in, like to support them in creating this theory of change process, to ask the questions of how they want to structure the NCG so that it makes sense in the region that they're set in. So like, I think this is also linked to another question that I was just reading here, like what if a KBA is between two countries, how should it be organized? I saw that there was already a response that they're envisioned to be collaborating for transboundary sites, but like that is also one of the questions that like these tools actually provide, like how to define the scope. And there's questions that what they do is basically create the room for a discussion so that whichever answer is arrived to, so it just gives guidance on which aspects to cover in establishing a new NCG, if that makes any sense.
Adrian, do you want to make your point?
Sure. Thank you, Andy. And thank you, Natalia, for a very interesting presentation and a very insightful document. What I was writing there in the chat is, you mentioned that both cultural and political contexts are very important. So I was wondering about those 11, I think 11 countries or 18 countries you mentioned that were the basis for your work. And were those countries representing all major areas of the earth, or were there any biases? Because as you know, there are very different cultural differences between, I don't know, Africa, Latin America, Europe, of course, or Asia. Thanks.
Thank you. That is a really good question. So I basically sent out invitations to interview everybody who had been involved in setting up an NCG. The people who responded, so like the 11 ones that have been set up are mostly around, well, Africa and the Middle East, Australia. It's mostly that area. Latin America, they're still in the process of being created. I sent out invitations to everybody, but actually for Latin America, I only interviewed one person, and then I got a response from somebody else who would have given me a wider context from Latin America when I had already like finished the interview phase and I was already looking at the results, so it was untimely. But definitely, yes, there's more, well, most of the NCGs have been spearheaded by organizations like, for example, BirdLife. So BirdLife partners are very active in Africa. So those are one of the first ones that were set up. And that is why, as part of the theory of change, because I did interview the people who had set these up, this had not happened in all places. And so that there is definitely like, not as much as, for example, representation from Latin America, but there is of Canada, which is a different context. There are Pacific Islands, there's Australia. So it has a bit more of a focus on like perhaps the Middle East and Africa, but even within those countries, we could see already differences, and there tended to be cross-cutting issues across most of these challenges were found to be existing in like all of these, and the successes were mostly in the NCGs that had more time, like the older ones that were already like adapting to circumstances. I hope that answers your question.
Just to add to that, we've just got funding to help support the establishment of KBA NCGs in Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and also 3 countries in the Congo Basin. So hopefully that will start to build up a larger sample size for perhaps a future project. I see Richard Sambola, you've got the hand up.
Yeah, okay. I am actually interested in the development of TOR for NCGs. Do TOR are developed specifically for countries NCG, or the TORs are just general?
Good question. So there are already some guiding TOR in the KBA website. However, they're very general. They're only supposed to like provide an overview of where this should be pointing to, maybe. But the idea is maybe to have a TOR, that would be for me the ideal thing, to have a TOR template that each country could adapt to their own structure. And that is basically that slide that I showed you with the like process, people, and the 3 Ps and the subcategories. That is what this does as well. So like it provides basically the themes that need to be covered, and each specific NCG would adapt that to its own terms of reference. Like maybe in one country, it makes sense to have like a government counterpart on. So like the terms of reference is like, okay, we'll embed this in a governance structure. And maybe in another country, the government is, I don't know, perhaps corrupt, and they don't want any involvement in this. So it makes sense to do it with an international NGO, or so like it depends on the context. But the idea would be to have like the different aspects or like themes, and each country would then adapt and take on what would make sense with their context, or even like in this, if a subnational NCG exists at some point, taking that as well to the context. So
I think one general conclusion to add to that is, although it may be difficult in some countries to include government, where government has been on an NCG, those NCGs have been able to move ahead far more quickly and work on the identification of KBAs and getting those KBAs recognized. So there's a huge benefit if you can include government on the NCG.
Right, and based on, again, like I was saying, each context, like it's one of the questions also in that slide that I showed was the people. So like it's about mapping out who is there, like who's an enabling factor, who do you want to participate, like who has leverage, like those are part of the questions that, like Andy was saying, makes sense. Like, okay, who has power in making this happen on the ground? Like maybe in some countries it's a grassroots organization. So like, okay, let's include them in this process so that we can have like more leverage in influencing decisions. So again, it depends on the context, but like government usually has like the national or subnational mandates to do this. So it's about finding ways to engage the specific stakeholder in the function that you aim for them to be involved in. And that's where clear roles and responsibilities also come in.
Okay, we're going to have to end there because I think someone else is wanting the Zoom channel. So thank you very much to everyone who's turned up and attended this. Thank you very much, Taya, for all the work you did for us last year and in presenting today. I'll try and get this up on the website by the weekend on the YouTube site, and Daniel will send around the link to that on the community Google listserv. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody.